Hi, I'm John Foster. I've seen so many of you before, but if I don't say who I am and why you should have any concern for my opinion, then people ask me afterwards. I'm a reference librarian here at Mentor Public Library. I have a PhD in history from the University of Washington, which is on the Cold War. And I thought to myself, why not give some talks about the Cold War this time around? So this is kind of a little more in my wheelhouse. So I thought now would be a good time to give a talk about the history of the Cold War, because one of the topics that's very much in the public eye right now is how we, the United States, are dealing with the countries around us. And let me just stipulate beforehand that I'm really going to stay off of modern political topics for your benefit as well as mine. Like, I don't want to talk politics from the lectern because you're a captive audience and it's not fair. If you want to take me across to BJ's and buy me a pitcher, you can hear all of my opinions about this, that, and the other thing. So the first talk I gave was on Harry Truman. Truman, as many of you who saw the talk will know, I find a really fascinating character, especially because his sort of reputation, if you will, or his, how he's viewed historically, has kind of suffered over the years for some reasons that are legit and for some reasons that are not. I mean, people say, well, we were unprepared when the Korean War started. That's true. The people in Congress had something to do with that too. And when Truman cut down the military budget, he believed, and I think that he had some good reasons for doing so, that he was doing what the American public had elected him, had given him a mandate to do. Eisenhower's reputation is interesting. I was talking to my parents' lawyer, as a matter of fact, who's also a family friend, and sort of historically inclined. And he said, well, Eisenhower was kind of a do-nothing president, and that was the good thing. To which I said, yeah, he was. That's exactly right. And this will be a sort of theme of this talk, like, where didn't Eisenhower send troops to? And the answer is anywhere. Like, he really was pretty good about keeping Americans in uniform within the bounds of the continental United States to the extent that he could. I mean, of course, Alaska too. So Dwight Eisenhower, he was an easy choice because I think he's just, once again, an absolutely fascinating guy and a real indication of the way that soldiers oftentimes do not make the greatest politicians. And the perfect example, and we will get to this in much greater extent in this talk, is Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was an excellent general for most of his career. His record in the Korean War was not, I think, entirely blameless. But if you look at his career leading up to that point, he earned every star, I think. But he was not great at domestic politics. Eisenhower, on the other hand, really was very good at domestic politics. And although he was a rather irascible man, and as those of you who listened to my earlier story will know, prone to some rather salty language, he was, I think, an example of real statesmanship on a number of fronts, and we'll talk quite extensively about how. Eisenhower was born in 1890 in a working-class family in Denison, Texas. His family were German and Dutch. They changed their name from Eisenhower to Eisenhower because they thought it looked sort of more American. Eisenhower means some sort of iron worker if you follow the German translation of that. His parents were very religious. They were part of a group called the River Brethren, a very sort of fundamentalist Christian types. Eisenhower didn't pick up a huge amount of that. He certainly was religious. He was not a very regularly church-attending type of person for most of his life. But that's, for those of you who've been in the military, that's not an uncommon combination. And I know that my grandfather, they asked him one time, sort of toward the end of his life, whether he was what denomination. He was like, well, I started out as a Methodist, but then I shifted over to the Episcopalians because they had a better basketball court at the church. My grandfather was a very pragmatic man. The family then later moved to Abilene, Kansas, which is where Eisenhower sort of called home for the rest of his life. He qualified to go to West Point. He was in the class of 1915. He originally tried to go to the Naval Academy, but he was too old. He had spent, I think, an extra year in high school. I'm not sure exactly why. The class of 1915 at West Point is often referred to as the class on which the stars fell. And the reason is because of the 164 graduates in that class, 59 eventually became generals. One of his classmates was Omar Bradley, another Second World War general of well-deserved and great renown. And they were lucky, too, in the sense that they graduated. This is 1915, right? So this is the First World War is going on. We don't really get into it until 1917. But a lot of those guys who were in that graduating class and then matriculated into the regular army got opportunities that graduates in other graduating classes didn't have immediate access to. And in fact, Douglas MacArthur, who's from an earlier class, I think made general during the First World War, if I'm not mistaken, although I probably should have looked it up beforehand. But I remember this because, who was it? Joseph Stilwell or someone who was a little skeptical of MacArthur said during the Korean War, well, the guy's been a general officer for 30 years, like, that's not good for you to be around all those people who agree with you all the time for that period of time. Here you can see Eisenhower on the football team. He was not a great player, but he certainly was athletic, and he was definitely a hard worker. He served in the infantry and training camps in Texas and Georgia. He married sweetheart Mamie Dowd, Mamie Eisenhower, as people tend to know her. They had a son, Icky, and there was 1920, there was a scarlet fever epidemic. And in those days, scarlet fever was very often lethal. And it was also, one reason for its lethality is that it was if you became infected with scarlet fever, very often, not dissimilar to COVID-19, it could be transmitted while you were asymptomatic. And Eisenhower, I think it was Eisenhower himself, hired a young woman to be nanny who was infected with scarlet fever. The child developed scarlet fever and died. And this was a feature of Eisenhower's emotional life for the rest of his life. I mean, it was really devastating. I mean, it's, I try and every now and then I think about what it would be like if my son died, and I just can't do it, right? It's, you just sort of touch the abyss and you're like, nope, not going there. So the fact that he was, back in those days, you can look at it and say, some people will say, well, death was more omnipresent. I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, it was a sort of more common feature of everyday life, but I think that the death of a child is always going to be devastating, irrespective of what age or environment you live in. Eisenhower served on the home front. He entered after 1915. He served at Camp Colt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he did mostly administrative tasks and really showed himself to be a very effective organizational officer. He was disappointed he wasn't sent to Europe because, of course, if you're in the military, you want to go where the shooting is because that's the way your career advances. Like getting combat service is the way to advance yourself if you're in the military, not surprisingly. He was then transferred to Fort Meade in Maryland, which is where the whole thing with his son happened. In the interwar period, he had a number of points of service. He served from 1919 to 1922 in the Canal Zone under General Fox Connor. Connor was his sort of mentor. Connor did a lot to sort of teach him about the history of military strategy, the importance of coalition warfare, and these things that, if you know anything about the history of Eisenhower during the Second World War, and of course you'll hear some of it from me, turned out to be very important. I mean, one of the key features of the Second World War and about the U.S. participation in the Second World War is that we had to be working very closely, particularly with the British, and that provided some interesting challenges. He was sent in 1923 to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he graduated first in his class, 1926. He was then viewed as a kind of rising star. Command and General Staff is the kind of place that you get sent if people think that you're going to, be a big wheel in the company eventually. And I can tell you, my grandfather taught at Command and General Staff for a while, and But teaching there and going there are two different things, let's not forget. He served as an aide to Douglas MacArthur. And he thought MacArthur was an interesting guy. MacArthur later, and just to sort of preview something that will come up, really disliked Eisenhower. And the reason was not for anything other than MacArthur really disliked anybody who had served in the European theater, because he didn't think that that was really where the war had happened. He thought that people who had served in the European theater were overrated. He also disliked Omar Bradley for the same reason. He also disliked George Marshall for also the same reason. MacArthur was very much a guy about the Far East. So he served, Eisenhower served with him in the Philippines. And then we get to this really interesting moment during the Hoover administration, 1932. So in 1932, this is the Great Depression is going on, and there was something called the Bonus March, which was the veterans of the First World War had been promised a kind of bonus. And I think it was meant to be paid out in maybe in 35 or later. But they needed money because the economy was really on its back at that point. And so between 15 and 20,000 veterans marched on Washington in a very peaceful march. I mean, they showed up, they built a kind of shanty town on the Anacostia Flats. They brought their families, because what else were they going to do with them? And they started having this kind of protest. Well, these were bad times for the Hoover administration. Late in the Hoover administration, the joke made the rounds that Hoover had asked, I think Andrew Mellon, his Treasury Secretary, for a dime so he could call a friend, and Mellon said, well, here's two, why don't you call both of them? But Hoover thought that the soldiers were really sort of sponging. I mean, he thought that he didn't have much sympathy for their problems, and he thought that they were asking for something that they didn't really have a right to ask for. So he instructed MacArthur to clear them out. And MacArthur, who really disliked any sort of show of dissent on anybody's part, called in soldiers, tanks, and Eisenhower, who was his aide, went to him and said, do you really think that this is how we want to handle this? Maybe we should find some better way of doing this. MacArthur's like, nope, we're definitely going forward. And then Eisenhower had showed up out of uniform. And the reason was because he wasn't exactly sure that he wanted the Army to be associated, the Army leadership to be associated with what was about to happen. And MacArthur said, no, go back, get your uniform on, because you're in for a dime, in for a dollar. The military used troops, cavalry, tanks, tear gas to clear the camps. They burned down the squatter camp on the Anacostia Flats. And this was, not surprisingly, a very unpopular move by Hoover. It came off very badly in the news because people thought to themselves, and I don't think unreasonably, these people put their lives on the line for the country, and now they're asking for something, and maybe they don't have exactly a right to it right this minute, but it's not like they're asking for a straight handout without having done something to merit it beforehand. They're just asking for a sort of different schedule. The view among historians now, and I think at the time too, was that it very much was one of the contributing factors to Hoover's defeat in 1932, although by that point the Depression was things were going so badly with the economy that Hoover was, somebody described his, if he would have put a rose in his hand, it would have just died. Like, so I'm trying to remember who said this, that being in his office was like being in a bath of black ink. That being said, although Eisenhower had misgivings about what MacArthur was doing, he also recognized that he was MacArthur's subordinate, and that MacArthur had, in the context of the chain of command, every right to instruct him to do it, and he did it. I mean, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Eisenhower was working in the War Plans Division of the U.S. Army General Staff. On the 14th of December, he's appointed the chief of the War Plans Division. Now, once again, remember, so this is the view of Eisenhower now, that he's a planning guy, that he's a logistics guy, that he doesn't really have any immediate combat type credentials. But his performance in the planning staff brings him to the attention of George Marshall, having the attention of George Marshall was one of the things that sort of accelerated his rise into top positions of authority. So the first thing that he becomes involved with is the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch. I'm just going to tell this story now because more of it will come later. And the evidence on the ground about what I'm about to talk about is a little as extensive as one might hope for. If you want more information about this, there's a biography. I think it can be found in the biography of Roosevelt, possibly, or maybe the book he wrote about Eisenhower by Gene Edward Smith. He had this driver, Kay Summersby, sort of his driver, his secretary, and he and Kay Summersby eventually had a relationship which was so serious that Summersby's friends were looking around for properties that they might buy in the UK so that they could shack up together. And at the end of the war, and this will come up more extensively later, Eisenhower sent a letter to George Marshall, who at that point was the commander of all U.S. Army forces, saying that he wanted to be permanently assigned to Europe so that he and Kay Summersby could live together. And Marshall took one look at this and said, no. And he sent him back a letter saying, I need you to, this is completely unacceptable. I need you to rescind this request. And if you don't, I will make sure that you're bounced out of the Army. Because Marshall thought it was just completely inappropriate for a married man and a U.S. officer to be carrying on this way. This will come up more later. But I was unaware until I read the Gene Edward Smith book about Eisenhower, about Kay Summersby, who seems like a really interesting character, but just is involved in this sort of rather unfortunate mésalliance with a later U.S. president. The invasion of North Africa, U.S. invasion of North Africa in 42-43, Operation Torch, is the first time that Eisenhower is in charge of combat troops. This is a real baptism of fire for the U.S. because they really don't have very much in terms of experienced combat troops at this point. The British had at least, had some people who had been in the British Expeditionary Force in 1940 and 1941. They had gotten pushed out of Europe by the Nazis, but at least they had had the experience of a kind of shooting conflict, right? But we end up getting into this shooting war with the Africa Corps, during which at a certain point they come storming out of the Kasserine Pass, pushing the inexperienced U.S. troops back. But then the U.S. troops stiffen. And Kasserine Pass turns out to be the first moment at which U.S. troops really find that they can hang in a fight. And this really changes their attitude. It changes people's attitude toward Eisenhower. Eisenhower's sort of in overall charge of this. And it really looks like this really burnished his reputation as a combat commander, which it's added to his already extensive credentials as an organizational and planning type commander. So one of the things that Eisenhower had learned from Connor, his mentor, was the importance of dealing with your coalition partners. And our main coalition partner in those days, the ones that Eisenhower had to deal with, were the British generals, especially Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery is a very odd man, like a rigorous vegetarian, anti-smoker. Brooke is an interesting guy, too. He had fought in the First World War, and Sir Alan Brooke, later Lord Alan Brooke, his diaries, his war diaries, have been published, and they make fascinating reading. He is very blunt in his commentary about practically everybody on his side, on our side. And he really thought that Brooke liked Eisenhower, thought he was an effective commander, thought he was a little timid. Mostly, so at a certain point, because of the way things are organized, Eisenhower is the sort of top-level commander, and Montgomery ends up as the sort of more immediate combat commander, which is weird for us, right? U.S. Army, U.S. military does not like to have non-U.S. military people telling U.S. military people what to do. And Montgomery didn't make it easy because he was a very blunt and rather arrogant man. He was about that tall. But what he lacked in height, he made up for in forcefulness of personality. Eisenhower wanted to kind of, this is sort of post-Overlord, post-D-Day. Eisenhower wanted a kind of broad front movement in Europe, whereas what Montgomery wanted was a direct thrust into Germany. And one reason this was sort of in the military mind of people at the time, and this is, sort of mid-1944 on, is because they were worried about the Soviets, right? What are the Soviets going to do? Because the Soviets are pushing hard now by 44. They've got both the superiority of men, superiority of materiel over the Nazis, over the Germans. And what the Allied military commanders didn't want was for the Soviets to get, to the Rhine, which is not exactly what happened, but the Soviets ended up getting rather further along in Germany than people would have preferred. But Eisenhower was really very much of a pragmatist in those days and brought a kind of pragmatic approach to the way that he exercised command. The war ends in May 1945. Eisenhower starts out as the military governor of the U.S. occupation zone in Germany. So they break Germany into three parts. And then the French say, well, hey, come on, we were part of this too. It's like, okay, we'll give you like if you look at the maps, the French zone of occupation, you can tell it was kind of an afterthought. And the same way with Berlin. So they split Berlin in four too. And the French part of that was not the ideal part either. It was clearly one of those things where like, oh, we got to give the French something. In November, he's appointed Chief of Staff for the U.S. Army, a position he holds until 1948. At that point, I think he wants to sort of move on to a new area of interest. So he resigns from the Army temporarily to become the president of Columbia University. And he begins writing his memoirs. But in 1950, Truman is an interesting story with regard to military people. Truman had been a captain in the First World War, and he had that sort of mid-level officer's skepticism about general officers, right? So many of you have heard me recite this quote. It's unclear whether Truman actually said the following, but it does reflect his thinking about it, which is why the reporter may have ad-libbed it, which was that Truman, in his sort of post-presidential days, at one point was asked about firing MacArthur, and he said, I fired MacArthur because he was insubordinate. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was. Being stupid isn't against the law for generals. If it was, half of them would be in jail. Needless to say, for that and many other reasons, Harry Truman did not make Douglas MacArthur's Christmas card list. And this is an interesting thing, too, because Eisenhower didn't like him very much either, although Truman really liked and respected Eisenhower, which makes what I'm about to describe sort of more tragic. And Truman also, I mean, he could get along with generals. Truman was an immense fan of George Marshall, after whom he named the Marshall Plan. Marshall was not the only person involved, but the Marshall Plan happened because Marshall had toured Europe. It was like, things are in a bad state there. And people might look at the situation there and think to themselves, well, maybe let's give communism a try, which nobody with a lick of sense wanted. So Marshall goes back to the president and said, look, we got to do something to kick European economies into gear, because there's a lot of people, a lot of hungry, a lot of dissatisfied people, and what we want them to do is get on the team as far as liberal capitalism is concerned, as far as free market capitalism is concerned, not decide like, oh, free market capitalism sucks again, let's maybe give communism in Europe a try. So the Marshall Plan, people say, why did we spend this huge amount of money in Europe? Well, the reason was because the Marshall Plan seemed like a much cheaper alternative by comparison to what we'd have to spend to fight actual communism, in Western Europe. By this time, there's an interesting sort of political dynamic going on in the United States. The Republican Party had just lost in 1948 its fifth consecutive presidential election. And this was a source of extreme dissatisfaction in the Republican Party, especially on the sort of right-wing, like what you might in these days call anti-globalist wing of the Republican Party. They were very dissatisfied with Thomas Dewey the first time around. They were super duper unsatisfied with Thomas Dewey the second time around when he lost quite shockingly to Truman in 1948 in a race which was deemed so thoroughly won by the Republican candidate by the middle of summer that the Republican Party stopped paying for polling because they assumed they were so sure that they were going to win. So what this wing of the Republican Party wanted was MacArthur. MacArthur, the sort of aggressive anti-communist, MacArthur, the sort of China hawk, MacArthur, the so the question around was, how did we lose China? Which is a bizarre question. I mean, some people have heard me say this before, and by the time we got involved in China, they were so far gone. The government was Chiang Kai-shek's government was so corrupt and so incompetent. At a certain point, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, had a meeting with Wellington Koo, the Chinese ambassador. This has happened, I think, in 1948, in which he said, or 49, 50% of the material that we're sending you is immediately being like surrendered to or sold to the communists, 45%. And if that number gets to 50%, you're going to have to think seriously about whether you want us to keep sending it, right? Because, it's not working out for you that well. MacArthur had a couple of views that are relevant to this. One is that he really was very Asia-centric in his thinking. He really saw the Chinese as the main threat in the world. He flip-flopped a little bit about this in public, but in private, I think he made it pretty clear that what he wanted was war with China, or that he was very comfortable with the idea of war with China. Most other people were not comfortable with this idea, especially our European allies, because what they recognized, or what they presumed would happen, and I think that there was fairly good reason for this, was that if there was a war with China, right, the Soviets would immediately invade Western Europe. And they could be, the estimate was, to the English Channel in a matter of weeks. There was really not much that we or anybody could do to stop it. It's not like we could drop a nuke on Germany, right? They're our ally. So the European allies, are very nervous about MacArthur's saber rattling when it comes to China. MacArthur also fancied himself as the US president, but he didn't really get politics very well. And what I think he was sort of hoping was that he would just sort of be acclaimed US president. He would come back, everyone would be like, oh, MacArthur, let's have him as president. And this is what the sort of right wing of the Republican Party wanted in those days too. What the more moderate wing of the Republican Party wanted was, they were like, yeah, general, that could work, right? Both parties were wooing Eisenhower. Eisenhower had made really no public pronouncements about his political views. He decided to run as a Republican, and the Republican Party, the sort of mainline base of the Republican Party, looked at Eisenhower and were like, this is a winner, right? He's very popular. He hasn't done anything that people massively dislike. He hasn't been fired by the president for insubordination. So there are these lovely "I like Ike" pins. This is just a great slogan. It just runs, it rolls right off the tongue. And the MacArthur side put out these things, but what is Ike like? And the reason was because Eisenhower had been very cagey about what his actual political views were. And the right wing of the Republican Party was very down on the idea of Eisenhower as president, because they saw him as another moderate, another guy who was not going to take an aggressive stance toward China, take an aggressive stance toward the communists, which is kind of ironic given, the guy's a general in the US Army. It's not like he's, waving red flags everywhere. But in the interim, Eisenhower had become the supreme commander of NATO. Once again, NATO was put together, according to Pug Ismay, one of Churchill's close advisors, to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. And once again, American policy was very Eurocentric in those days. It was very much about our European allies, trying to keep Western Europe on side vis-a-vis the communists, trying to find some way to keep communism from spreading, because the Soviets had created that kind of buffer of client states, is like the nicest way of putting what they did in Eastern Europe. And they left a long trail of dead bodies doing it. So another sort of candidate that the right wing of the Republican Party had on its radar was Robert Taft, son of Ohio, very prominent senator, very, very conservative. Taft had a couple of problems. One of them was that he was just not a very compelling speaker. And that clip that I showed you of Eisenhower, I mean, imagine seeing that live. Eisenhower has real gravitas. Taft lost out at the convention, and then a couple of months later, it turned out that he had metastatic pancreatic cancer. I think it was pancreatic cancer. And he died several months later. But Taft also had been instrumental in the massive cuts to the defense budget that had left the U.S. Rather unprepared when it came to the Korean War. Eisenhower didn't have the greatest relations with Truman. And partly it was because he didn't think much of Truman. He thought he was a Missouri machine politician, which he was. But also, at a certain point, with Eisenhower running against Truman, Truman had set up, so it was traditional for the sitting president to set up a national security briefing for both the main candidates of both parties. And somehow it happened that Eisenhower was not properly invited to this. And Eisenhower was very upset about this. And Truman was very apologetic about it, but it happened. Also during the campaign, this is the era when McCarthyism is really getting going. And at a certain point during the campaign, McCarthy announced that he was going to give a speech, I think in Wisconsin, I'm not sure, in which he was going to accuse the Stevenson campaign, the campaign of Adlai Stevenson, Democratic candidate, of being shot through with pinkos, punks, and pansies. And that further, he was going to accuse Stevenson of being a homosexual, which was probably not true. And in any case, the Democrats viewed that as not an appropriate sort of means of politics. So the Democratic Party gets wind of this, and they contact the Eisenhower campaign. And they said pretty much straight out, according to this is according to Gene Edward Smith, so I invite you to look at the record that's of this. But this sounds plausible to me, which is why I repeat it. If they contact the Eisenhower campaign, told them, if McCarthy gives this speech, we will release the letter that Eisenhower wrote to George Marshall asking to be reassigned to Europe. And the Eisenhower campaign said, OK, message received. Got in touch with McCarthy, said that under no circumstances should he give such a speech. And McCarthy relented. Now, later on, Truman, while he was still president, was informed of this letter, and he sent someone over to the War Department to pull it out of Eisenhower's file and destroy it as a courtesy to Eisenhower. He also had Eisenhower's son furloughed from military service, combat service in Korea to come back for the inauguration. So anyway, another sort of tradition was that the incoming president would come to the White House on Inauguration Day, come inside, they would have lunch together, and then they would drive to the inauguration together. Eisenhower pulled up, this car pulled up, and he refused to go inside because he was so annoyed at Truman. And Truman, Bess had laid on a big spread and everything, and Truman finally had to go out to the car, no lunch, and just drive to the inauguration with him. And it was, you will not be surprised to hear, a fairly tense atmosphere between the two of them as they drove. And apparently the only conversation that happened was Eisenhower said to Truman, I just heard that my son got furloughed and he's going to be here for the inauguration. Did you do that?" And Truman just said, "Yep." And that was it. So Eisenhower becomes president in 1953, January of 1953. And the first thing he does is helps broker the armistice in the Korean War. He had said during the campaign, "I will go to Korea." So I put on this slide of him. This is John Foster Dulles. I'm not related to him. I was not named after him. My parents were Kennedy-type Democrats because we're Irish, you know, as much as anything else. Eisenhower became president at a time when foreign matters were as important to the U.S. presidency as they had ever been. I mean, the days of the isolationists in the 1920s and 30s were pretty much over. Like, the U.S. government had really realized, if we're going to keep things, I mean, we're the main force for democracy in the world now, the main force for liberalism in the world now. Liberalism with that sort of capital L, like, you know, free markets, human rights, the whole 9 yards. Truman came in with the realization that he was going to have to be a sort of internationalist president. The first thing he does is he goes to Korea, and eventually this truce is negotiated with this armistice negotiated. You can tell how fraught the discussions were, because here are the North Koreans over here. Here we are over here, and you see who's not there, the South Koreans. The South Koreans, Syngman Rhee, the president of South Korea, absolutely rejected the whole thing. And as a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, the North and South Korea are still technically at war, because Syngman Rhee would not accept an end to hostilities that didn't involve the South controlling the whole country. But by that time, I mean, you know, the last 2 years of the Korean War were a bloody, brutal stalemate. And, you know, the soldiers used to say, "Who wants to die for a tie," right? I mean, basically, they were fighting this sort of fight to sort of stick with the status quo ante, you know, the division of Korea that had existed at the beginning of the war. And that's a pretty lousy thing to do. You know, we make this deal with soldiers, right? That you, like, we may ask you to give the last full measure of devotion, but we're not going to do it unless it's in the service of a crucial need for the United States. And it was. I mean, this is the first sort of moment of what's come to be called limited war, right? So this was the first time that we'd gotten into a war that hadn't been resolved in that sort of like large sense of resolution. And this would really change the way war was fought from the Americans' perspective till now. I mean, it continues to be a major factor. Iran, 1953, a government comes to power under Mohammad Mossadegh, and he's a nationalist. This is a theme that's going to repeat. Mossadegh was a little bit toward the left. He had some people in his government who were communists, but not a lot. I think it'd be a stretch to characterize his government as communist. People are a little sensitive about Iran at this point, because they're right, sort of, you know, those of you like who've lived through the 1970s, 80s will know that Iran is very strategically placed up next to the Soviet Union. And it's also a very significant oil producer. And the oil production in Iran was run by BP now, but it's Anglo-Iranian Oil Company at the time. And Mossadegh is a nationalist. I mean, he's not. People later tried to sort of paint him as some sort of raving communist, but really what he is an Iranian nationalist. And so, from Mossadegh's perspective, the concession on which the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company leases had been negotiated had been done under British domination, and so were not fair. So his response to this was to nationalize the company. The British were, not surprisingly, not very thrilled about this idea. So there was a sort of view between the British and the United States that something had to be done, right? Because this is part of the kind of larger process of decolonization that goes on at this time. But it's also, you know, oil is a key resource, even in 1953. And also, what we don't want, what the United States and the British don't want, I mean, what the United States especially doesn't want, is expansion of Soviet power, which they view as sort of made more possible by the rise of Mossadegh. So what they do is the CIA engineers a coup. And they engineered in favor of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. That family had been ruling Iran before. They sort of put him in power. It's not an especially bloody affair, but it does depose Mossadegh, who had been legitimately elected. I mean, some people have said later, well, how legitimate was the election? As far as I think people know, Mossadegh was legitimately elected. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi sets this really interesting trajectory in Iran because he's very Western oriented and he Westernizes the society. So by the 1960s and 70s, Iran is one of the most Westernized countries in the Middle East. And in fact, it's especially in terms of the role of women. Women can go around without their heads covered. They can go around wearing trousers. They can have jobs. And and this rubbed certain elements of Iranian society, especially the very religious fundamentalist types, the wrong way. And so the Shah was viewed as being both intimately connected to the West and a Westernizer. And so when the Khomeini people came around, their deal was like, well, we need to get back to real Iranian values. And part of those values are, women need to step back from all these Western freedoms that they've taken up. But here's another thing. How many US troops did we send? 0. And note this well, because this is a recurring theme. Eisenhower doesn't commit US troops to the problem. The CIA is involved, but he's not sending uniformed American troops over there. December 8th, 1953 is the Atoms for Peace speech, and the reason why this is key, the reason why I played an earlier bit of it for you, is that Atoms for Peace was part of this sort of new look policy that Eisenhower was rolling out. And what he wanted was to shift the narrative about nuclear energy from a weapons type narrative to a power type narrative, to a development type narrative. So what he's saying is, he goes to the Soviets and he says, look, we'll create this stockpile of fissionable material, and we'll help people build these power generation reactors. I mean, he's willing to essentially partner with the Soviets if the idea is we can have a shift in the way nuclear energy is viewed, from looking at it as potentially a weapon of mass destruction to making it the source of electricity that all its backers had sort of been pushing ever since people figured out that we could have, develop nuclear energy. That, nuclear energy has the power, has the capacity, has the potentiality to be a clean energy source. Fission doesn't necessarily work that way just because it creates a lot of waste, or creates waste that has to be stored and is radioactive for a long time. But the long-term idea is, what we want to do is shift the idea to making nuclear power a development thing rather than a blow people up thing. 1950, Jacopo Arbenz Guzman was elected as president of Guatemala. He was a very moderate leftist. Once again, had a couple of communists in the government, which was probably not a great idea. At that time in Guatemala, United Fruit owned 43% of the arable land. And they kept a large proportion of it fallow. They did not grow banana. They were in the banana business, but they kept a large portion of it fallow for a couple of reasons. One, to control the market for fruit growing land. Two, they said to indemnify them in case there was some sort of blight, that they could have non-blighted land to plant on. Guzman says, well, look, we have a real land crisis here. Arbenz, I guess is really what they call him. So what we're going to do is we're going to nationalize some of this land, and we're going to pay you in bonds payable over time. And we're going to pay you an amount equal to what you claimed on your taxes was the value of the land. Now, two things. One, United Fruit comes back and says, well, that's not really the value of the land, to which the Arbenz government says, but you wrote on your tax forms that that was the value of the land. Also, one of the former board members of United Fruit was Allen Dulles, whose brother was John Foster Dulles. And you can kind of see where this might have gone. And you can kind of see here, this is a political cartoon, the CIA dredged up this. Number one, this is a first case of like a real sort of advertising blitz. The CIA hired this advertising company in New York to run these junkets down to Guatemala to show how the Arbenz government was screwing everything up. And then they dredge up this guy, Castillo Armas, and they stage a coup. You can see here's Castillo Armas, you can see Eisenhower, and it's shaped like the American Revolution. And then there's Dulles here with the United Fruit flag. And they stage this coup. Now, once again, this inaugurates several decades of military rule in Guatemala, which was quite brutal. But once again, how many US troops get sent there? 0. And once again, this is Eisenhower. Like, I'm not going to send US troops into combat if I don't absolutely have to, if it doesn't make sense to do it. Earlier in 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalizes the Suez Canal. Once again, this is one of those kind of decolonization type things. Nasser is very much a nationalist. I mean, there's really no two ways about it. Nasser was not in any way that you could really say sort of like a leftist in any way. But what his view is that this is really should be Egyptian. The Egyptians should benefit from it, so they nationalize it. The British, the French, and the Israelis then concoct what can only be described as a harebrained scheme in which they will concoct a sort of rationale for invading and then sort of set up a kind of protectorate over the canal. The British and the French, it's because they have economic interest in the canal. The Israelis, because they are looking for sort of territorial gains. They do not contact the U.S. government about this. So when it happens, Eisenhower is livid because he really thinks this is the kind of thing that should have been negotiated. It really could have been resolved without this. But also, like, we're the #1 power around. You need to contact us about when you're going to do this, right? Because it affects us too. And he finally tells the British, either you stop this foolishness or we will cut off oil deliveries to you. I mean, he really threatened them with something that could have severely damaged their economy. And it was mostly because, Eisenhower is a moderate. He really wants to organize things in such a way that people aren't shooting at each other. He has a very clear idea of what he wants. He wants to stop communism. He's come up with this idea of massive retaliation. He told the Soviets, look, we are ready to use nuclear weapons. Now, the problem with the massive retaliation doctrine is he announces this around the time that we're funding 80% of the French war in Indochina. The French spent more money on the war in Indochina than we gave them for the Marshall Plan. And they're about to lose the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And it becomes clear that, where are we going to massively retaliate? What are we going to do? Like drop a nuclear bomb on Vietnam? Like, that's just not going to work. But he does it to kind of make the point to the Soviets, look, we're serious about this. We're in it for real. We're not going to allow this kind of like chipping away. In April 1954, he outlines what he calls the domino theory. And this is a thing which has a long subsequent life in American foreign policy. The idea of if one of these countries goes down, the country that was being talked about in this particular case was Indochina, then all the countries around it will go down. And this becomes a rationale for doing all kinds of things. I mean, this is, in a lot of ways, the kind of rationale in Eisenhower's second term for the setting up the Bay of Pigs, which Kennedy then ends up on the hook for. In domestic policy, really the most important thing that's going on is the civil rights movement. So in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education happens, and the Supreme Court, I just want to read you a couple of lines from this. You're mostly probably familiar with it, but this is from Earl Warren's I do a talk about Earl Warren, and my subtitle for the talk about Earl Warren is The Last Boy Scout. I mean, Earl Warren, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, his central idea was that everybody deserves a fair shake. Like, you may end up with different outcomes, but the fact of the matter is we got to have, like, everyone's got to have, the fundamental premise of America is everyone's got to get a fair shake. So this was from Earl Warren's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of law, for the policy of separating races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of the children to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. Whatever may have been the extent of psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy v. Ferguson, which was the decision that inaugurated separate but equal, this finding is amply supported by modern authority. Any language in Plessy v. Ferguson contrary to this finding is rejected. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So Eisenhower didn't really agree with this, but for the reason that he was a moderate in the sense that he thought that, desegregation was probably a good thing in the long run, but he thought that it needed to be done slowly. To which the civil rights activist said, it's been, there's been 200 years, It's not like we haven't had a chance to get things right. And I think there's a legitimate view there. But so anyway, in the wake of Brown v. Board of Education, we get the crisis in Little Rock in 1957, where the Arkansas schools are ordered to desegregate. The high school in Arkansas in Little Rock says, okay, we're going to have black students. There's a sort of popular outrage at this. There's another student behind her, not perhaps showing the sort of Christian love and dignity that you would hope for your fellow citizens. The governor, Orville Faubus, is unalterably opposed to this and eventually calls out the National Guard to stop these 9 black children from being educated at the white high school. Once again, Eisenhower is pretty upset by this because he's a gradualist, but he thinks, look, the Supreme Court made this decision. And he nationalized, he tries to negotiate with Faubus. Faubus is immovable. So he nationalizes the National Guard and sends the 101st Airborne down to make the point. The Supreme Court has ordered that this will be the case. So it's going to be the case. And he gave this speech, and I think that this is an excellent illustration of Eisenhower's statesmanship. Whenever normal agencies prove inadequate to the task and it becomes necessary for the executive branch of the federal government to use its powers and authority to uphold federal courts, the president's responsibility is inescapable. In accordance with that responsibility, I have today issued an executive order directing the use of troops under federal authority to aid in the execution of federal law in Little Rock, Arkansas. This became necessary when my proclamation of yesterday was not observed and the obstruction of justice still continues. It is important that the reasons for my action be understood by all our citizens. As you know, the Supreme Court of the United States has decided that separate public educational facilities for the races are inherently unequal, and therefore compulsory school segregation laws are unconstitutional. Our personal opinions about the decision have no bearing on the matter of enforcement. The responsibility and the authority of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution are very clear. Local federal courts are instructed by the Supreme Court to issue such orders and decrees as might be necessary to achieve admission to public schools without regard to race and with all deliberate speed. So, he's like, this is, I think, a sort of an indication of what sort of public figure Eisenhower is. He's like, look, I don't necessarily agree with this, but the Supreme Court in our system gets to interpret the Constitution. And once they've done so, whether I like it or not, whether Orville Faubus likes it or not. That decision has to be respected. And he sends troops down there to make it happen. This is not an immensely popular decision in the South. But at that point, Republicans are not terribly, this is still the sort of solid South of the pre-George Wallace era in the United States. And at that point, Republicans are not particularly popular in the South. So I think that, Eisenhower didn't think he was losing much on that score. In the final days of his presidency, Eisenhower gives a farewell speech, which once again merits quoting. It's referred to as the military-industrial complex speech. And what he basically says is, we need military power because we're in a situation that's very dangerous. The power of communism is there, and it's going to be there for the foreseeable future. So we need to have a way to stop it. And so we need science, too, to help in the development of military hardware. And what he says is, today the solitary inventor tinkering in his shop has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly for the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination over the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and gravely to be regarded. So he's nervous about the idea of this connection between military research and the university system. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in prospect as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy should itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society. Another factor in maintaining the balance involves the element of time. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, our government, must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of our political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. And what he's saying here is that what he's worried about developing in the United States is what he calls the military-industrial complex. That this concatenation of military-industrial power will become so great that it will damage the democratic institutions of the country. And this is one thing you really got to like about Eisenhower. Because he really has his eye on the main thing about the country, right? We can be good or we can be bad, we can be right, we can be wrong. But what we need is our democratic institutions, and those are the most important aspects of our society, because we can work through the rest of the problems together as Americans. It's our responsibility to try and make the world better for ourselves and for other people. And to do this, once again, we have to maintain these institutions that we have in the country. We have to maintain our democratic institutions. We have to maintain these, the free market, liberal individualism that have defined what America is all about. And also, we have to create a situation in which everybody gets a fair shake in the country. And these are, as far as he is concerned, not partisan issues, right? His version of the Republican Party ideology is we need to create and defend these institutions, and these will be the thing that the Republican Party, So you notice that, and I meant to mention earlier, when he becomes president, he keeps around some of the sort of New Deal stuff, but he reins in the cost of it. So he's very much about, we need to have these institutions that there's a commercial I remember from my childhood in the 70s in which people say, we don't want a handout, just a hand. And that's what we want. What we want is a society that will help people who are ready to uplift to be in a position to uplift. Because that's the way we get, what we don't want is a society where everything's flat and equal. What we want is a society in which everyone has equal dignity and equal opportunity. And that, I think, is the central pillar of Eisenhower's politics. Interestingly, too, although he was strongly anti-communist, he really did not like McCarthy very much. And especially when McCarthy started attacking the army and claiming that the army was loaded with communists, McCarthy then really ran afoul of Eisenhower, who at that point was willing to allow him to be censured by the Senate. Because once again, Eisenhower was very much about, let's have a civilized, decent polity. We want to stop communism, right? Every sensible person does. Like, Stalinism is a horrible system. Like, no sensible person is for Stalinism. So what we want to do is create a society that's obviously better, right? And that's, it's remarkable that a guy whose experiences growing up are in the military, which is very much, I have great respect for the military, but it's very much a top-down organization. I mean, there's like, we're in charge, you down here are not. But he is very much about, wanting to create this, for lack of a better term, great society in which the values of freedom, of individualism, of personal initiative are defended, are promoted in the country. So we live out the ideals of the founding fathers. So in this speech, January 17, he sort of finished by saying, in the Council of Governments, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. Once again, we need to defend the democratic institutions of the country. We need the military, we need industry. We need it to be part and parcel of our democratic institutions rather than dominating them, either because they're trying to or because they've accumulated so much power. So he leaves power to be succeeded by John F. Kennedy in January 1920. He spends the sort of balance of his life working on his memoirs. He eventually dies, I believe, in 1969 at the age of 78. He'd had a series of heart attacks prior to that. So what were the achievements, that we can look at? Number one, he fixed a lot of problems in the world without sending any U.S. troops there. And I think that you got to like that as a problem solving. I mean, you can look and say, well, should he destabilize the government of Guatemala? Should he have seen to the overthrow of these legitimately elected people? That you can debate. What you can't debate is there were no U.S. troops there, and that's a good thing, right? He was responsible for Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which was part of the building of the interstate highway system. He experienced the annual GDP growth in the United States was nearly 3%. Eisenhower's republicanism, what is often referred to in historical texts as modern republicanism, which sought a middle ground between conservative and liberal politics. Like, Eisenhower wanted to be dead in the center, to bring the sort of impulses of both wings of American political life together and try and find some common ground. He oversaw the Korean Armistice. He oversaw the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The first civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction that worked to promote and protect voting rights for African Americans. He established NASA. He oversaw the passing of the National Defense Education Act in 1958 to strengthen education in science, mathematics, foreign languages. I benefited from that because I got a grant to learn German when I was in graduate school. And it was a government program that was a direct offshoot of that. So I thank him for that. So Eisenhower is president at this moment when the Cold War is threatening to turn hot. There's the war in Indochina that the French end up losing. We get a sort of 10-year hiatus in that before Kennedy involves U.S. troops in I say 10, I mean about 7, involves troops in Vietnam. There's 1958, the communists take over in Cuba. That's sort of roiling, but it's not until, and he is sort of coming up with the idea of the Bay of Pigs. Once again, the Bay of Pigs was mostly meant to be Cuban exiles. The idea was, we'll put these Cuban exiles in there, the people will rise to support them, yada, yada, yada. There was supposed to be some sort of U.S. military backing for it, but when it started to go south, Kennedy said, well, no, we're not going to. Because once again, U.S. presidents by and large, and Kennedy being the exception here, are very hesitant to put U.S. combat troops in harm's way at this point. And the experience of the Vietnam War sort of reconfirmed. I mean, Johnson is sort of like living out Kennedy's policies. He's kind of stuck with Kennedy's policies after Kennedy's assassinated, which is a subject for a later talk, which I will be giving in 2 months on John F. Kennedy. But the thought I want to leave you with about Eisenhower is that he is really a model of a kind of centrist politics that is the kind of thing. The American system operates better when it operates toward the middle. And what Eisenhower did very much was find consensus in the middle on the sort of better instincts, the better angels of our nature, to quote Lincoln. And you can look at different aspects of Eisenhower. You know, was he perfect? I could spend another hour here, which I will not do, pointing out the sort of like unsympathetic criticism of his administration. But I think that the thing worth thinking about Eisenhower, the point worth taking away about Eisenhower, is that he really wanted the American system to operate the best that it could. And the way that it operated the best that it could was by finding a place in the center where most of us are and living there. So thank you for your attention. I've talked too long.